I pull into the driveway just as the late afternoon light drapes over the house, and there it gleams. A sleek black Mercedes, ribbons still taut, its engine humming, as if to announce its arrival. A photographer crouches low, angling for the perfect shot of Travis beside the driver's door. He beams under the car's haloed flash, everyone else clustered around him, clapping and cooing. My heart tightens when I realize there is no parking spot saved for me. Inside, the dining room is alive with chatter about Travis's big day. Lace doilies and helium balloons crowd every surface, while a table laid for 8 is trimmed in crisp linen, but not a single place setting bears my name. When dessert emerges, my grandmother tugs at my sleeve and directs me to a folding chair by the wall, its paint chipped and feet unsteady. I take it, smoothing my skirt as faces turn toward the cake before settling back on Travis. When he finishes blowing out the candles, my father leans forward, clasping a Tiffany blue box in his hands. "For you," he announces, sliding the velvet pouch across the table. The room hushes as Travis lifts the lid, to reveal a delicate silver necklace, its pendant glinting in the warm glow. Cousins gasp, aunts murmur, and the photographer adjusts his lens to capture every drop of joy in Travis's eyes. Moments later, it is my turn. My father holds out a small envelope, stamped with the family crest but taped too casually at the edges. My fingers tremble as I peel it open and pull free a thrift store jacket sealed in plastic. The plastic crackles, and I catch the scent of musty mothballs. The fabric is coarse against my palm, the elbows patched clumsily, the size tag dangling like an insult. I lift it, inspect the crooked seams and a small coffee stain near the collar. My dad chuckles and clears his throat. "Vintage, right? Vintage, right?" he says, voice loud enough to carry across the yard. Cousins exchange uneasy glances. One cousin whose smile once greeted me at every family event, now shrugs and turns away. A silent photographer snaps a single click and shifts attention back to Travis and his new necklace. Later, I slip out to the porch, the plastic still clinging to my jacket. My mother appears beside me, smoothing her dress from last season. She leans close, voice soft but sharp. "He never needed a hand-me-down," she says, nodding toward my jacket. I imagine her curdle the words before pressing them into my ear. Later, I overhear her on the phone, telling a friend that I've always thought too highly of myself and deserved a reminder of my place. I stand under the porch light, jacket in hand, remembering every lonely midnight I spent studying under a single desk lamp. Every weekend I skipped with friends to clock extra hours at the cafe, just to cover rent. My diploma sits quietly on my apartment wall, unseen by these people who celebrated Travis's milestone but handed me a faded cast-off. I fold the jacket and tuck it into a box by the door. As I drive away, the Mercedes's taillights fade into the evening. In the memory of that photographer's flash lingers proof that I was present, even when I was treated like an afterthought. I slip into the thrift shop jacket and feel the odd weight in the inside pocket. My fingers press into the lining until they find a stiff edge. I tug, and a heavy corroded key falls into my hand. The key's head is stamped with the name of a bank I only know because my grandmother once complained about its merger years ago. I turn it over, trace the old imprint with my thumbnail, and feel certain it wasn't tucked away by accident. That evening, I settle at my kitchen table beneath the dull buzz of the overhead light. I carefully peel back the lining, revealing a slender slip of paper etched with ink so faded it almost vanished. The letters scramble across the page, a secret code I recognize from my library research days. My journal's margins hold the same substitution key I used to crack obscure ciphers for fun. My pulse quickens as I translate each phrase. Someone warned that a child was deliberately excluded, that a family fortune was buried beyond reach. My eyes water when I read "trust no sibling," the words jagged and urgent, as if my grandfather spoke them directly. Next I unfold a brittle sheet pressed into a triangle. The map's creases crack beneath my fingertips, and I glimpse the faint outline of a county road I once drove down during summer visits. Hand-drawn circles mark a spot near an old bank building my grandma described in hushed tones, the one that closed after the merger swallowed its name. Water stains blur an instruction warning against selling a certain parcel of land. I remember her voice trembling as she mentioned an oil lease she never understood, but knew someone later buried its records to keep them hidden. To be sure this isn't my imagination, I cross-referenced the bank name carved into the key with an online archive I'd bookmarked. An article recounts how local historians found the bank vault empty when crews boarded up its doors. I feel the key grow heavier in my palm, proof that those records didn't vanish. They simply waited for someone with this exact key to retrieve them. The coded note, decoded with my own handwriting key, the rusted key stamped with that long-forgotten bank name, and the hand-drawn map tied to memories of my grandfather's hushed stories all insist this treasure hunt is real. I empty the jacket's lining a second time and find a scrap of worn paper tucked beneath the hem, a shorthand annotation in my grandfather's crisp script, reminding him where he stashed the ledger under a loose floorboard in the basement vault room. I gather the key, the deciphered message, the creased map, and that tiny note of directions. As I step out into the night air, the street lamps seem to guide me toward that silent bank. Each item attests to its own truth. Metal stamped by a real institution, ink faded by years in a forgotten pocket, paper worn by time yet still legible. My heart pounds with relief and resolve. I am no longer the bystander to my family's secrets. I have the proof, and I am ready to unearth what they buried. I stared at the screen when Joel's profile appeared on the genealogy site, his family tree mirroring mine in ways no strangers ever could. The match notification showed a cluster of shared relatives, my grandfather's siblings, his cousins, each name igniting memories I'd buried. When I messaged Joel, I described the faded adoption records I'd found sewn into that jacket pocket, and he confirmed he still had the original agency file tucked in a shoebox. Booking my ticket felt surreal but necessary. I landed in his hometown under gray skies, and followed his directions to a quiet cafe, where he sat nursing a black coffee. He slid his folder across the table, pushing forward a handwritten adoption certificate, listing my grandfather's signature scrawled in the margins. He'd kept it hidden in a drawer, he told me, afraid to believe he belonged anywhere else. Back home, I returned to the probate office, its shelves heavy with dusty files. I pulled the contested will from the shelf, flagged by a yellowed sticky note. It was the draft that included both my father and Joel as heirs. The clerk whispered that the final version, with only my father's name, had been notarized without the usual second witness signature. I ran my fingers over that page, noticing the slight indent where ledger pages had been torn out. Later, I visited the energy firm's small investor relations office. Their brochure boasted about leasing acreage in East Texas, complete with a map that matched mine exactly. I asked for their lease payment records. After a few days, an anonymous email arrived with a PDF showing regular royalty deposits into an account bearing my family's initials. The quarterly totals were modest for them, but the steady stream told a different story about hidden wealth. When I confronted my parents, their living room felt impossibly small. I laid Joel's certificate, the will draft, and the royalty statements on the coffee table. My mother's lips trembled as she admitted they feared Joel would claim a share they'd never budgeted for. My father, voice low, confessed they'd agreed to keep the adoption quiet, so quiet that even I had never known. Now Joel and I speak almost every evening, our calls filling in decades of missing family history. I've instructed my attorney to submit a motion to reopen the estate file and compel the energy company to account for every penny paid under that oil lease. I keep Joel's adoption papers on my desk, alongside that crumpled map cornered with his initials. His signature on the cafe receipt and the judge's handwritten note in the will draft are my proof evidence. These secrets were never just stories, but real betrayals, inked on paper and sewn into jackets, waiting for us to uncover them. I slipped the torn request slip across the counter and watched the clerk's eyes drift to the empty filing cabinet behind him. He mumbled something about a fire, some time back, but couldn't point me to any newspaper clipping or fire report. His apology felt hollow against the empty shelves where my family's mineral deeds should have lived. Later, I found Marjorie at her favorite diner, stirring her coffee with a hand tremor that spoke of decades behind that counter. She thumbed through a battered notebook, then produced her own photocopies yellowing pages that still bore the county seal. My name appeared on one, tucked beneath Grandpa's signature, stamped by the recorder's pen long before his mind began to wander. Marjorie shook her head, recalling how he had paused in her office, eyes bright, and asked that both grandsons share everything. Fair and square, back home, I rifled through Grandma's cedar chest and unearthed a letter in her neat script. The edges were water-stained, but the words leapt out. He had confessed guilt over a hidden boy, and hoped his grandsons would never know favoritism. His closing line, urging that no one be erased by blood, matched the handwriting on Marjorie's photocopy. When I sat across from my father, I set the photocopy beside the letter on his coffee table. He stiffened, jaw working as he denied knowing anything about Grandpa's instructions. I slid over 2 signature samples, one from the photocopy, the other from the forged transfer papers. His usual precise loops had been replaced by hurried strokes on those oil transfer forms. He stared at the evidence, silent. He admitted that after Grandpa's illness, family members had agreed to remove my name. They'd claimed a basement flood, destroyed the deeds, yet no plumber's invoice or restoration estimate ever crossed my path. Even the caretaker's daughter, Eleanor, later told me she'd donated a stranger's jacket to a thrift shop, never suspecting its pocket held the dusty key, the coded note warning me to seek the ledger, and the water-smudged map marking the very plot now owned by a corporate giant. My father's voice cracked when he confessed they'd feared my claim might undo all they'd built. He said he'd meant to protect me, but protecting himself had come first. His words hung between us, as I recalled the soft smell of mildew from that jacket pocket and the thrill of decoding a message intended only for my eyes. Under the light of my desk lamp, I laid out every piece: Marjorie's photocopy, Grandpa's letter, the jacket's contents, and the examiner's report confirming the forged signatures. Each item was proof, tactile and undeniable. The empty shelf at the recorder's office, the clerk's fumbling excuses, and the charred remnants of a lost archive all pointed to a single truth. My place in this family history had been stolen, but the layers of cover-up unraveled, through ordinary people's memories and the persistence of paper. At last, I closed the chest and breathed out a long-held tension. The fire they claimed had hidden the deeds had only revealed my own resolve. I would rebuild what they tried to bury, one genuine document at a time. I stood frozen as Dad's voice echoed through their polished living room, each word cutting sharper than the last. His hand shook around his mug as he bent close and hissed, and if I ever mentioned the contested trust, he'd bury me. His tone too familiar from nights when he'd warned me about asking too much. I remembered holding the faded page of Grandfather's draft, the one carefully hidden inside an old leather diary, his handwriting still clear, confessing regret that one grandson had been written out, begging that his sons share everything he left behind. That document had felt like proof in my trembling hand, and now it was all on the table. Mom hovered by the entryway, her shoulders tight and her voice a whisper when she finally spoke, tears catching in her throat. "Joel's life is stable now. Why dig up what's been buried?" She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the same way she'd tucked my hair back after I cried, holding the original will, the lawyer's letterhead, still crisp, where he'd emailed it to me. Even her plea was evidence. She believed silence was protection. Earlier, Uncle Pete's late-night call had arrived, as I stared at the single light burning in their kitchen window. His voice was urgent as he told me he'd seen internal minutes where family friends had praised Travis as the chosen heir, and how the family attorney quietly circulated papers to hand him sole control. He warned that a legal team was already gearing up to freeze my access to any assets, and his final words, delivered in a tremor, were that I needed to decide if I'd stand for fairness or step back. Dad slammed his mug down, sending a ripple across his reports on the table calculations he'd emailed me earlier under the guise of fairness figures, claiming every cent they'd invested in Travis versus what they'd ever given me. I held that spreadsheet printout, each line item a reminder of the nights I drove through storms to pay emergency bills, the repairs I arranged when their heating broke, the silent sacrifices I made. I glanced at Mom's trembling lips and realized her tears were for the facade she'd helped build. I cleared my throat and read aloud Grandfather's own words, the one scrawled in the margins where he'd written of his shame. "No child should feel invisible in the inheritance I leave." I watched Dad inhale sharply, saw the color drain from his face. The letter had water stains from the shared laughter when I first found it hidden between photo albums, and I'd held it out like a torch in the dark. Mom's hand brushed mine as I folded that letter and placed it on the table, the paper thin but unbreakably real. She murmured sorry, but the apology hung between us like a gauntlet. I looked back at Dad. My voice was steady when I said I wasn't there for money, but for the truth. The room fell silent, the final proof hanging in the hush of their shame, and I knew that whatever came next, I would no longer be the one erased. I stood in the courthouse hallway with Joel clutching the manila envelope that held the photocopies from grandfather's cedar chest. The ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle, showed entries for oil lease Weston family, alongside transfers into a corporation bearing our family name but registered in another state. Holding that page in my hand, I felt the weight of every foregone royalty. Next, I revealed Eleanor's old journal, its cover creased and stained, where she'd poured out guilt about hiding the boy and her wish that my grandsons share in what I found. I read aloud her scrawled confession about the midwife's daughter, smuggling those papers out to keep them safe, and I watched the judge's eyes narrow in interest. The clerk called us into chambers, and I quietly handed over a printout of my DNA match with Joel, illuminated by the soft lobby light. The report listed our shared markers side by side, proof that the cousin I'd only met weeks earlier belonged in this story. Joel's fingers trembled as he traced his name on the paper, and I sensed the magnitude of that moment for him. Later that afternoon, I uploaded scanned spreads of those documents into a secure site, then messaged a rural investigative blog that specialized in unearthing local fraud. By evening, their article appeared with a headline about hidden oil fortunes and a missing heir, including side-by-side images of the forged signature on the probate form and grandfather's authentic handwriting from an old letter. Readers flooded the comments, one remark comparing the scheme to draining an unseen well. And suddenly the story had legs. Meanwhile, my brother posted a casual video on his social feed leaning against a polished truck. He sneered that I was wasting time chasing ghosts in dusty books. Below his boastful grin, I recognized the dealership invoice someone had sent me. The truck had been purchased with a wire from an account I'd traced back to those shell companies. I forwarded the invoice screenshot to the commenter who asked about financing, and watched as dozens more demanded he explain how he'd afforded it. That night, my phone buzzed with a terse email from the judge's clerk. All distributions from the family trust were paused and a full audit of every related corporate registry was ordered. Reading those words felt like a title release, as if the pages of that ledger had finally been read by someone who truly cared. I pictured the rows of data being examined, each business license, each tax form, each bank slip now under scrutiny. Outside the courthouse, a small group held handmade signs. Some read "Truth Matters," others simply "Weston Justice." Cameras flashed as Joel and I stepped onto the front stairs. Eleanor's journal and the ledger still tucked safely in the envelope at my side. Reporters asked for comments, and I simply nodded, pointing to Joel before whispering, "We did it." The proof was no longer hidden in basements or fire claim records. It was in plain sight, undeniable, and finally believed. I walked through the grand hall now quiet, my palms brushing the carved wood where my grandfather once etched secret instructions into his ledger. That ledger, rescued from a burned archive by a retired clerk who risked his pension to photocopy, brittle pages showed my name listed alongside my newly discovered cousin Joel. When we stood before the judge with those pages and a bag of notary receipts torn from the will contest, the gavel fell in our favor. Joel's relieved laugh echoed off the marble, as the clerk snapped the last approved stamp on our settlement papers. In the days that followed, I registered my new surname at the county office, feeling a strange weight lift when I saw Blakemore printed on my driver's license. The clerk handed it to me with a sympathetic nod. She'd seen the court records. My reflection in the glass felt unfamiliar, freed from the shadows cast by my birth name. Behind that victory, I launched the JW Initiative Scholarship Fund in the same room where oil company memos once hid in drawers. I printed my grandfather's heartfelt letter, found tucked in an attic trunk behind faded photographs, and pinned it above a donation box. Within hours, handhouses, written applications arrived from students describing crumbling classrooms and rides on school buses held together by hope. A teacher knocked on my door, her eyes bright, clutching a letter from a young girl who wrote of her dream to study geology on the very lands my family's greed had once silenced. A month later, I dialed into Hidden Legacies, a podcast whose host had pored over those forged deeds. I shared the moment I discovered the burned will was never in the county newspaper, and how a forensic examiner confirmed my father's signature on the transfer forms didn't match his handwriting elsewhere. Listeners flooded the chat with stories of their own lost inheritances, and one sent me a photograph of a ledger they'd uncovered in their grandmother's trunk, drawn by the same midwife who'd delivered Joel. Back in my childhood home, My parents watched that episode in stunned silence. My mother pressed her palm against the TV screen when the host read Eleanor's ciphered note. Trust no sibling, she'd warned, and my father's jaw tightened when clips of my lawyer laying out my plaintiff motion flickered across the screen. I didn't call them afterward. I let their shame speak for itself. Weeks later, a downtown courier knocked and handed me a package wrapped in soft, worn leather. Inside lay a jacket whose lining still bore the seam where Eleanor's code had hidden. Tucked in its pocket was a slip of paper and Joel's careful script. You gave me back my history. Never forget yours. I slipped it on, the leather warm against my skin, and felt the heartbeat of every story I'd reclaimed. In that moment, I understood that true freedom didn't come from the legal victories or the foundation I built, it came from reclaiming the truth and wearing it close to my heart.